In 1983, Ray Williams was assigned to UNTSO in the Middle East as a peacekeeper. He served on 2 stations, initially on the Golan Heights and then finally into Beirut. It was the civil war which was raging in Beirut at the time that caused the ongoing trauma for Ray and many others. This has led to the push for the reclassification of this service, not just for Ray, but for all peacekeepers who were caught up in the crossfire of this civil war during the period 1983 to 1984. Ray is joined by fellow Peacekeeper Paul Copeland, who is now advocating on Ray's behalf for recognition by the Australian government to have these ADF members that were placed in untenable situations and yet have been denied the recognition for having served in an actual war zone. Let's start to where we are today. I would like you just to have a chat about how many years you've been fighting for recognition and the steps that you've taken, the roadblocks that you've hit over the way, and what you would like to see for the future. So let's start right where we are today.
Right, where we are today is, it's ticked over 26 years and on the 24th of August of this year that I've actually been fighting the system, so to speak, which is mainly defence. And this came about because I had a rejection letter on the 24th of August in 1998, and that's what triggered all this. I couldn't believe that they wrote back and said to me, sorry, but being in Beirut or wherever you were sort of thing, they didn't really care. That, no, that wasn't warlike. That wasn't warlike service. It was peacekeepers, You weren't there, you weren't fighting an enemy, you weren't achieving objectives, and so they get a whole string of definitions which they pulled out of their hat. That's fine, but leading up to that, right, when I first started in 1998, right, I was in the wilderness because I'd had nobody to guide me. I wrote my story down, right, I included what information and references I could find at the time, which was fairly limited by what I know now. And I approached the various politicians and members of Parliament, and Minister for Defence, and Minister of Veteran Affairs, and all I basically dealt with was with their advisors, who just quoted what the writings were saying, and don't call us, we'll call you. As you can see from the files here, these are the current active files which I'm working on. And some of these are the storage ones, background information. There's a great volume of detail. The work's been put into it, not only by myself but my advocate and the people that have been helping me. It wasn't until about 2008, and at that stage of the game I was having a interview or a chat sort of thing with Brigadier Bill Rolfe, who at that stage of the game was the Commissioner for DVA. And old Bill had sat on my application for at least 2.5 years and did nothing. And then he said, well, perhaps Ray, he said, maybe you should go and see the Nature of Service branch. He said, I know the fellow over there. So he rang up a fellow by the name of David Webster, and I went across and saw David. He was a ex-brigadier who was sitting in the position. And that prompted him to say, well, this is very good, Ray. You've got it all in longhand and on pieces of paper and all that. He said, I know this all on digital. Right? And he said, that's the way we're going now. So I went away, and very early in 2009, I gave him the CD discs, right? Not the old USBs we have now, but the CD discs, and that contained the maps, statements. And one of the major statements came from the operations officer, who was the other Australian serving with me, by the name of Joe Casey, right? They were very supportive. I also solicited statements from the senior Australian officer at the time over there, a fellow by the name of Lieutenant Colonel Keith Hall, members of the Canadian forces that were actually serving with me, members of the Finnish force. So I tried to cover the whole gambit. This went to the Nature of Service branch, which then prompted Brigadier Webster to say, well, he'd put out a matrix.
The matrix, we're talking about the one for the service review of a general nature, was actually submitted to the Minister of Defence at the time, and the Minister didn't want to commit to it, and the reason why is because it was meant to be reviewed every 3 months as like a decision support tool that they were making in terms of conditions of service, and I can sort of understand why the Minister didn't like it, because I think he said there was no wriggle room in it, or no room to wiggle. The point being is that if something occurred, like an ambush on a United Nations patrol, for example, and that was just a short skirmish, a short contact, and it wasn't an ongoing sort of conflict, it sort of put into question as, well, should that be war service or should that not? That's a debatable sort of matter. But if it's a protracted sort of conflict that goes for, say, a week or so, or even up to a month, in which has occurred over time, and in your period, that war was going on since 1978 at least, there'll be the sensible decision to make to say, oh, well, that's war service. So I think what they were trying to do was look at, if someone was killed, not accidentally, I would say, by hostile intent, and that was a one-off, for example, or sporadic, they wouldn't sort of deem that whole operation as war service. Well, basically after that, there was consideration made, and I think that prompted the Nature of Service branch within Defence to actually review the matter, and that took 10 years of writing this particular report, which is probably the longest ever report that has been written in the history of Defence, I would suggest. And I think there was a minimal consultation with the veterans concerned. There was a call for papers and comments on the matter. However, I think that I'm not too sure if that was actually considered within the report when you actually read it. It certainly doesn't mention any sort of consultation in that regard with the veterans at that time.
When you were assigned in there, 2 weeks before that, in October,
Yep.
300 French and US peacekeepers were killed by truck bombs.
Yes, they were.
Why didn't that have any bearing on the Australian Government and Department of Defence for their decision-making process on what was warlike service and non-warlike service?
Well, would you believe the stupidity of it all is that Defence wrote back and said they weren't attached to UNTSO, so therefore it doesn't count.
So, despite them dying in a violent conflict with truck bombs driven through their barracks, and I believe a couple of Lebanese civilians also were killed, that the Australian government states that is not relevant to declaring your service warlike.
No, because they weren't part of UNTSO. No?
But they still died.
Oh, they still died, yes. Well, and that was just a few kilometres down the road.
So out of all the Islamic belligerent groups that were in Beirut at the time, fighting each other, there was also the presence of the Israelis. What were they doing there under Operation Peace for Galilee?
They were trying to remove the Palestinian Liberation Organisation from southern Lebanon, right? And to do that, They use various forms of force besides their incursion into the bottom end of southern Lebanon, but their warplanes were bombing Beirut and the suburbs around it. They're bombing into the Shuf Mountains. Yes, whether or not they achieved the aim, the Israelis can tell you that. But from our point of view, we only saw one side of it, and that was generally the end where it all went bang at the end.
Whose decision was that? Was that the United Nations or was that Australia's?
No, that's the United Nations. Yeah, that's part of their mandate. Right? Because peacekeepers are not supposed to go to places where it's dangerous, where it's a war zone. But how do you know it's going to be a war zone or not a war zone? And that's the problem we have now, is that we were caught in the crossfire of a war, a full-blown civil war. We're fighting belligerent groups, we're fighting other armed camps, right? Throw in the multinational force, Lebanese armed forces, the Israelis. It was a mix. It was a real absolute mess, okay? And then to turn around and say, well, this is not a war. This is not a war, well, what is a war? What is defined as a war then?
Well, you've been through that process
Yes.
with Paul Copeland,
Yes.
and it was defined very clearly to you by a bureaucrat in Canberra about what they saw war as. And do you mind drawing on that, how they saw, how they defined in their limited thinking and experience what war was?
So it came to a point, particularly in early February 1984, when West Beirut was being highly targeted. Most of the Western embassies that were located there were evacuated, including the Australian embassy. As a matter of fact, embassy staff were cowering, sheltering away from the artillery and rocket fire that was striking the Australian embassy at that time, and were waiting for a break in the fire to evacuate. It took some time to get out. The multinational force was unable to prevent those attacks. So what occurred after those embassies were evacuated in February, we then saw the gradual withdrawal of the multinational force out of Lebanon completely. The last remnants were the US Marines that stuck around and protected the US Embassy, and the US Embassy was evacuated onto the warships that were with the 6th Fleet at that time in the Mediterranean. Australia did not send another ambassador back to Beirut after February 1984 until 1995. That gives you the idea of the threat that was actually available at that time. That meant that they had to take their embassy staff out for their own safety. You got to ask the question, with Ray's case and Major Joe Casey's case, they weren't evacuated out for their own safety. They were remaining in position, and they were undertaking their duties as they were doing before the actual conflict came to the point where it did at that time. They remained, I would suggest, a lawless society that was imploding on itself. The government of Lebanon had already resigned. There was no government in Lebanon. There was an all-out firefight between all the factions. And there you have two Australian observers stuck in the middle of it with an insurmountable amount of ordnance flying around the area from February to March. It begs the question again, what is Defence thinking when they refuse to acknowledge that this was a war zone for those two Australian soldiers? So around 2018, we met with the then Minister for Veterans Affairs, Darren Chester, a Victorian minister at the time, who wanted to resolve this matter. He genuinely wanted to see it resolved. We had advisors in there, we had officers from the Military Strategic Division in there, who were legal officers, who, I must say, had no idea what we were talking about in terms of veteran entitlement law. the situation was that Defence undertook to go back and look into the matter, and particularly with the war that was going on in 1983-84, and from what we believed was them making the undertaking that they were actually going to review it. Now, Ray and I didn't know at the time that this long promised review report into the conditions of service was almost complete. So I think there was a bit of a false representation from the advisors and from Defence at that time in wanting to genuinely, if I could say the word, resolve the issue. They had no intent to resolve the issue. Let's just face it and get that fact straight. They had no intent. What was going on at that time was that there was a report being written by another Lieutenant Colonel at that time in Nature of Service branch, who, with his Director General, had a concept in their minds that war service was infantry throwing grenades at each other and tanks driving over the parapet on the barbed wire. I would suggest that they've been watching too many movies, and particularly Saving Private Ryan, because that was the concept in 2019 when we went in there to brief them on the situation that Ray had experienced in the Lebanese war. That was their concept of what they believe war services should be about. That is the most bizarre and ridiculous interpretation of warfare that I've ever seen. It was the viewpoint, the subjective viewpoint of a person who holds power in a senior public service position who has no idea of what war service is about. She then went on to say that the people, for example, in the forward operating bases, mind you, at this time, we were still fighting wars in Iraq and Afghanistan at this stage. The people in the forward operating bases, which are just as dangerously exposed to peril and rockets and fire, didn't do too much in the back lines, so they shouldn't get anything at all. As a matter of fact, they're lucky to get non-warlike service. And I just looked at this person who, by the way, only served 4 years in the Royal Australian Navy as an air traffic controller in Nowra in New South Wales, who'd never stepped out of Australia. The same with her Lieutenant Colonel officer that was with her, who never went to a war zone in his entire military career. And they were sort of backing each other up when they were explaining this. And I was absolutely gobsmacked that this is the viewpoint of someone making critical key decisions on behalf of those who are serving and who have served Australia in the most horrendous situations and conditions, that this is their belief.
Would it be fair to say that that paper that came out of that was a complete failure by Defence to adequately and objectively investigate Operation Paladin for the warlike service spikes?
Yes, it was, because A, it wasn't objective for a start. We had no right of reply. Myself and Major Joe Casey were not interviewed. We're not giving our side of the story. We were denied access to the references. Right? The report itself was very heavily redacted. Right? And any arguments that we put up to the Defence were just ignored. So, you know, it was a one-way street. It was Defence's way or no way.
Has that been sort of the criteria over the 20-odd years you've been fighting?
It's been the theme, yes, been the theme. And I still reiterate today that, you know, that research paper, I believe, right, was written to a predetermined outcome. In other words, you know, we've made our position clear. Let's not stuff it up by only, you know, writing something different.
The report that was signed off by this Director General that believes that war service is infantry throwing grenades at each other and tanks driving over people, that was signed off by her. The document was severely redacted, and as I've mentioned before, it was given the classification of secret. Now, the excuse, it was an excuse. It wasn't a reason, and it wasn't certainly a logical reason. The excuse given was, we don't want to harm the Commonwealth's standing within the international community. It's a review into conditions of service of Australian officers who have served as military observers in conflict and war zones in the Middle East. How can it be that highly classified? You're supposed to be looking at the conditions that they actually served within. That's what conditions of service is called. Their branch, by its very name, is called Nature of Service Branch. So how can a nature of service be so highly classified when people are obviously stuck in the middle of a war zone with bullets flying everywhere, artillery shells and rockets flying through the air, everyone killing each other around them? How can that be highly classified? You've got to ask that question. It's ridiculous. So the document that they crafted together over 10 years was blacked out in most of the references that was named. And for me, looking at that document, it was very difficult to actually research where they got their references from, how they came around to the decision making that they made, because they've prevented a transparency and they've prevented an accountability. Mind you, the Vice Chief of Defence Force signed off on it, and so did the Minister. So you've got to ask the question, are they just signing things without even reading them? Because I would suggest that's the case. Even though they may read the one-page brief that's in front of them to make that decision, you could be any sort of senior public service servant in the Australian government and shove something under the Minister's nose and that person will sign it off. So it could be anything that they sign off, and they won't even know the consequences of it until later on. That just shows you the accountability and the decision making that's going on. Very, very poor.
In 2006, Israel went across the Lebanese border again, this time to tackle Hezbollah, which is who they're currently fighting.
Yes.
Are you aware what occurred out of that deployment for those group of peacekeepers?
Yeah. Well, part of that, when the Israelis went across the border into southern Lebanon, standing in their way was a number of OPs manned by United Nations forces, okay, the Peacekeepers. One of those bunkers was targeted by the Israelis, right, which eventually killed 4 Peacekeepers. This necessitated other Peacekeepers to withdraw from that area, okay? Now, by withdrawing from that area, they encountered a problem, those 4 Peacekeepers, the Australian Peacekeepers, and this led to the Australian story, which was a 3-episode feature, which was going to be aired on the TV. The government got wind of this because the 3rd episode would have certainly embarrassed the Rudd government. Okay, not only the Rudd government but Defence as well. Prime Minister Rudd at that stage of the game said that he wanted that sorted, fix it, and that period of time was then reclassified as warlike service, right, for those 4 Australians that were caught up in that southern Lebanon conflict. But the caveat was that it's not to be used as a precedence. Well, to me, a precedence is a precedence. So how can you say don't use it as a precedence? All right? So this is one of the contentious points that we've made back to government as well, that, you know, how come that situation was not repeated or can't be looked at for people in Beirut or other parts of UNTSO?
So in comparative terms with Ray's service, and that was probably the worst kind of situation that any soldier could ever find themselves in. Within Beirut, 1983, 1984, rounds of ammunition being expended all over the place. There was a constant barrage of artillery and rocket fire. There were French Air Force and US Navy aircraft from the 6th Fleet doing bombing runs close. The artillery rounds landing close and reducing West Beirut to rubble, literally, while Ray was living there and existing there, I should say. It puts the context of this is what a war is about. Yet Defence will say that's not war service. If I can go back into 1975, when UNICEF, the United Nations International Children's Education Fund, Emergency Fund, asked the Australian government to evacuate orphans out of Saigon in March, April 1975. Now, when I put the questions of notice to Jackie Lamy to represent this matter in the Senate, Defence came back and literally said there was no military threat assessment done, but they were granted war service. So for Royal Australian Air Force Hercules transport aircraft flying into Ton Son Nhut Airport in Saigon, evacuating orphans and taking off, that was war service. They weren't armed, they had no rules of engagement, they had no orders for opening fire. Yet Ray was unarmed, no rules of engagement, orders for opening fire in Beirut. Doesn't get war service, but these guys do, for evacuating orphans. It makes a very, very big joke of the system itself. It is so compromised, it's not funny. In that respect, you've got to say to the Australian government, these men served in the most perilous situations that anyone could ever fight in. It'd probably be likened to the trenches in World War I, for example, where, as the Director General said, people throwing grenades at each other and tanks driving over the parapet. Very similar situation. But this public servant didn't have an idea of what she was talking about. It was quite clear about that. When we look at war service, it's not only about the fact that you're there to kill somebody, you're actually there, you could be there in a support role. So in Somalia, we sent an infantry battalion over there, and peacekeepers were already in place at that time. The lawlessness in that place was very similar to what Beirut was at that time. So a very similar situation. There was no government, there was no rule of law in place, and they had to go in there and provide intervention operations so that the population could be fed. So those sorts of scenarios, when you place them into context, where does it place Ray and Joe Casey when they're stuck in the middle of a war with combatants fighting each other? Bullets don't say, oh, okay, I'll avoid this person when I'm flying through the air at the speed of sound because they're UN peacekeepers, so I'll just move that side. Because that sounds like the thinking of this Director General of Nature Service Branch and Defence. Oh, this artillery round coming through, well look, oh shit, there's a UN post. I think I'll avoid that just in case I accidentally kill a UN soldier. Well, that's not going to happen. Once they're fired, they're launched. There's no discrimination on what ordnance in the air does to people when it hits the ground or when it impacts.
So in relation to that then, what steps were taken to prevent that being used as a precedent?
Right, besides the Rudd government saying that it can't be used, the VCDF sent a letter to these 4 peacekeepers and said, although Defence doesn't support it, right, the decision, okay, we won't rescind the warlike service off you and we won't remove your medals. But to be aware that you're not supported by defence. Now, that must have been gut-wrenching for them. Must have been gut-wrenching.
Would it be fair to say that that letter, which was obviously designed to prevent you using it as a precedent, was an act of bastardry?
Yes, it was, especially on Defence's point. It really was. Right? You know, that shouldn't have been written in the first place. No way.
So from today, Ray, noting that everything that's gone on since 1956, all those spikes, you know, in the 70s, the 80s, and the 80s went on, the warlike environment there for quite a few years, wasn't over and done with in a short time. You know, 2006, today, and numerous other spikes. What is it you'd like to see occur out of all this, out of all your work that you've done, starting off by yourself, now with, you know, a lot of people talking to ministers, talking to the Chief of Defence, Admiral David Johnson. What would you like to see?
Well, probably the culmination of all this is that we don't have or have not had the right of reply to these, not so much allegations, but the statements put forward by Defence. Our arguments haven't been listened to, right? We can't countermand anything or dispute the references because we're not entitled to it. So this brings us down to, why can't we have a independent review by a semi-judicial person that has some sort of background knowledge of Defence activities? But keep it at arm's length from Defence and DVA. Don't be influenced by them. Let's have an independent umpire, right? And that not only would be beneficial to my case, because we would have the opportunity to put forward our case and our views and countermand what Defence is saying, but it would also give these other people from these other deployments the opportunity as well. And why not? And if everybody agrees to abide by the umpire's decision, so be it.
Would you like to see it under a person or a panel?
I think a panel, because one person can be biased. They don't, may not have a full understanding, right? I think a panel would be more appropriate, right? And they need to interview those people that are on the ground. They need to interview people that, you know, have a story to tell.
Would you like to see veterans represented on that panel?
I certainly would, yes.
Rather than just be made up of bureaucrats out of Canberra?
Yes, I do. Yes, I would.
So Ray, all these years later, is there anything else you'd really like to say?
There are other people out there that have done similar and been exposed to similar situations I have, and they too need to be recognised. They really do. Because I'm sure they've had their traumas in life, and it's affected them probably in many ways, right? It's affected me in a number of ways, and it's affected other veterans as well. And Defence is not doing their homework, and they're not doing justice to the veterans.